Good morning, good afternoon, whenever you're watching this. Sorry, I thought that I had it full screen. So what we're going to do is the first day assignment for next week, or for the week of October 19th through the 23rd. You guys are going to take some notes just like we would in class. I'll try and keep this video less than 15 minutes. That way you can kind of build onto the assignment for next week. So without further ado, we are starting the evolution unit. Evolution go ahead and think about or define the word evolution in your own words. Write that down on this slide. Pause the video if you need some additional time. I'll try and leave you guys a few seconds, but define the word evolution in your own words right now. All right, so hopefully you have some sort of a definition that goes along with this idea that throughout time we see this process of biological change by which descendants come to differ from their ancestors. What that means is the original organism, whatever that is, in this case we're talking about the cell phone or the mobile phone, has throughout time changed until we see the phone that most of us have today, a smartphone or an iPhone. Okay, so basically what evolution is saying, we started somewhere, and because of nature and because of the environment, we had to change to be better suited for it. So the descendants, the newest individuals, are different than the first or the original individuals. All right, so this theory of evolution is relatively new. It happened kind of in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and a lot of scientists in the 1700s and 1800s were trying to answer these two questions. Number one, how old was the Earth? At this time, they didn't know exactly how old the Earth was, and this was super important to them because it kind of leads to how has the Earth changed and how have the organisms on Earth changed throughout time. Okay, so how were they going to change? We're going to focus on four main scientists: Carolus Linnaeus, George Louis Leclerc de la Buffon, Erasmus Darwin, and Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Okay, I don't expect you to memorize their entire names. Okay, if you just remember Linnaeus, Buffon, Darwin, and Lamarck, you should be fine. The issue with Darwin is we're going to talk about his grandson, Charles Darwin, later in evolution. Okay, so Erasmus kind of set the stage or was the precedent, but Erasmus Darwin, or what I'm going to refer to as E. Darwin, is the grandfather of Charles Darwin, C. Darwin. And he's a much bigger deal, and you'll find out more about him later as we cover more evolution stuff. Okay, so Carolus Linnaeus, he thought that all organisms needed to be categorized in some manner or some way. So what he did was he created what was called the Linnaean classification system. We still use Linnaeus's classification system, but it's a little bit different than when he originally made it. Okay, so when he originally made it, you fit into three what he called domains or groups. Okay, you were either a plant, an animal, or a mineral. If you were considered a living thing, you were in one of those three groupings. Okay. Now you can see Linnaeus's ladder. We have kingdom, class, order, family, genus, and species. Okay. So we went more specific than just having those three groups. Okay. So what Linnaeus kind of noticed was that some subgroups or smaller groups needed to be made. Okay, because people were upset that we were in the same group with other animals. So humans and elephants were in the same group, and a lot of people in England got offended by that. So what Linnaeus did was he said, okay, we're going to find a way to subcategorize them. And the way that he made these subcategories was what's called species. A species, or what we typically think of as a population, is two organisms that can interbreed. Okay, so when I take one donkey and one donkey, if I cross them together, they should be able to produce a donkey. Okay, so that makes them the same species. The additional step is that they have to have a fertile offspring. Okay, if you know anything about donkeys, they are infertile. We bred them to be workhorses. Okay, so what happens is a farmer takes a horse and a mule, mates them together to get a donkey, and donkeys are just used for the work that they don't want to use their prize horse for. Okay, horses are very expensive, donkeys are not. So they are not considered the same species as a horse. Okay. So what Linnaeus does in his lab is he kind of creates these new hybrids. So he'll take like a jaguar and put it in the room with a hyena, see if they mate. If they don't, then they're not the same species. Ethically, we got to think about, is that morally okay? Is it all right to just take a badger, put it in the room with a wolf, and see what happens? More than likely, the wolf's going to eat the badger. Okay, so there were some failures in Linnaeus's original system, but it's how he learned how to subcategorize. So to go from having these three large groups over here and breaking them into smaller groups here. Okay, and we're going to talk more about Linnaeus's classification system by discussing what's called a cladogram. Okay, cladogram is basically a family tree, if we want to think about it like that. So what we use a cladogram for is to show that some organisms are related based off specific characteristics. Okay, this is a very basic cladogram, but we know one thing: all living things are made of cells. So I can put a check mark, an X, whatever you guys want to put here to know that all of these organisms are made of cells. Okay, that'll be important here in a minute. All right. However, not all of them have legs. Worms don't have legs, but the rest of them do. Okay, and I can keep going through here and saying, okay, these organisms all have legs. Spiders don't have antennae, so then only the three at the bottom. And you'll notice that the more specific I get, the more characteristics that I add, the less and less organisms have that trait. Okay, fewer and fewer organisms have that trait until eventually I have one characteristic, in this case, two sets of wings, that only one organism has, my dragonfly. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the next slide and say how we use this. Okay, so like I said, a cladogram is very similar to a family tree. So we're going to set this up like it's a family tree. Okay, so I draw a straight line. You can see my long line down the center of the slide going up at an angle. And then I'm going to put my very first characteristic down at the bottom. In this case, that's cells. Okay, so cells, all of the organisms in front of that trait are going to have cells. Here is the first branch, or the first organism that's made of cells but doesn't have the rest of the characteristics. Okay, so if I click the slide, I'm going to see that I have cells, and then worms were that first one that only were made of cells but didn't have legs. So the next trait is something that the organism doesn't possess. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you guys to do is have this slide filled in on your own. There's a branch up there behind my screen. For you guys to go ahead and do that. So you'll put legs, you'll put the other characteristics in each of these boxes, and then the organisms will go at the forks of the cladogram. All right, so we're going to investigate more on Linnaeus, but I kind of want to move on to Buffon, or also known as Buffon. Okay, so Buffon was very famous at his time as an evolutionary scientist, so he wrote a book. This book was called Histoire naturelle, basically the natural history. And this book discussed the relationships among organisms, the sources of biological, what he called variation, and the possibility of evolution. Okay, so what this book is basically saying is that all organisms came from one ancestor. And then throughout time, those ancestors had to morph and change based on where they were living. And because they had to change or vary, that's how we get the organisms that we see today. Okay. Buffon was a little extreme, but he was supported by the church because he kind of said that, hey, this one organism could have been God. It could have been a God. He really didn't go into much detail about what the one ancestor was, but he said that that organism could have been a God that gave variation to many different organisms. And the Catholic Church is very prominent at this time. So they support Buffon. They help him get this book published. They kind of promote Buffon's ideas. Okay. Versus Erasmus Darwin. Okay. Erasmus Darwin had this idea that everything came from a common ancestor. But what the church didn't like was he said that more complex life comes from simpler or less complex life forms. Okay, not a big deal. He's basically saying the exact same thing as Buffon, except for he makes the argument that bacteria gave rise to everything else. Okay, and the church did not like the idea of us as humans came from single-celled organisms. Okay, so they really did all that they could to make sure that Erasmus Darwin's work was not published, was not shared readily. Okay, basically they're saying Buffon is right because God gave life and he made everything after him in his image, versus Erasmus Darwin is saying that evolution came from single-celled organisms rising up over time. Okay? All right. And then introduce Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Okay? Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, or just Lamarck, presented evolution as a change to your environment. And this is something that these two guys, Darwin and Buffon, didn't really talk about, was how they changed. Lamarck answers that question saying that because the environment changes, we have to change with it. If we don't change with it, we die. Okay, so you can look at his theory about how giraffes were made. The first giraffe is more like a cow or a small horse, okay, who can eat shrubs and grass that's all on the ground. But throughout time, you'll see that because there's not as much grass or not as many shrubs, the giraffes actually have to stretch up and stretch out their neck. And throughout time of stretching and stretching and stretching, they get a long neck. Okay? So now, when we see giraffes, we see this long-necked organism. Okay? So his idea was that by using a trait continuously, the offspring will acquire that trait. So what I want to kind of do is propose this idea. This is me, if you can believe that. This guy right here, super ripped. When I have a kid, my kid Logan, is going to look like this because I work out all the time. That's what Lamarck's theory was. If by working out all of the time I get very muscular, then my kids or my offspring will then also be very muscular. Okay? That's false. Okay? I can run, I can work out as much as I want. My body might change, but my kids is not just because I work out a lot. Okay? All right, I think that's my last slide. All right, if you have any questions about these scientists, I know that was a lot of information. Please let me know. Again, make sure to fill out the slides that you'll turn in so that I have kind of a grade for you guys this week. If you have any questions, please email me. Thank you. Have a good day.